So for online students, I'm going to make an introduction to Photoshop video. It also is kind of really closely going to be following the introduction to Photoshop worksheet, which I believe can be found in week 2 of the course, or maybe 1. I can't remember if it's week 1 or 2, but it's an introduction to Photoshop worksheet. You can download that, you can look at it, but basically I'm going to be kind of going over a lot of the things that are in that worksheet in this video. So we're actually going to go to, when you come into Photoshop, make sure that you're in the correct workspace. So if you go to Window Workspace, you can go to Essentials, just to make sure that you're in the correct workspace. It should look similar to what I have here. You can pop out your toolbar with this little arrow to match my own. So let's talk about image size a little bit. If we go to Image at the top menu and then Image Size, you can also do Shift-Command-I to make this little box pop up. But basically, this dialog box gives you an overview of the size and resolution of the image that you've opened. So the resolution of this image is 72 dpi because I actually downloaded this from a free website. It came off the internet, so it's set to 72. But it's also extremely large. If you see, it's 76 inches by 50 inches. If I actually check the resample, let's see, if I uncheck the resample and put in 300, you can see that it's changed the size to 18 by 12 once I've upped the resolution of the image. And we want it 300 for print and 72 for screens. So you can actually change the resolution of your images, but make sure that the resample is unchecked so that everything is linked. So that when you do change the resolution, that you're not just falsely changing the resolution, because you can add more resolution to a 72 dpi image, but you're not actually improving the quality of it. It's kind of hard to understand, but just make sure that these 3 things are linked when you change the image size. And as you can see, 18 by 12 at 300, 18 by 12 inches at 300 dpi, or pixels per inch, is still a really pretty high quality image, great for print. So yeah, that's kind of how you get to the image size, and you can check in image size by going to Image, Image Size. Now if you go to Image Canvas Size, this tells you the size of your canvas. Sometimes it's in pixels, you can change it to inches if you like. It's 76 by 50 because I didn't actually change the resolution or change the image size. So sometimes your images might be smaller than your actual canvas size in Photoshop. So if I shrunk this image down on this canvas, I could have a smaller image on the canvas. So the canvas size is 76 by 50. So that's how you find your canvas size. Color modes are also important. We kind of went over this in part 3 of the color assignment, but if you go to Image Mode, you can see we can make this black and white by going to grayscale. We can make it RGB, which it already is because I pulled it off the web, or CMYK for print. So that's where you would actually find the color mode, which is an important area within Photoshop to know about, because a lot of times you're going to be changing images from RGB to CMYK when you go to print, or the opposite. If you take an image that was for print and you want to use it for a website, you have to change it to RGB before you use it for your website. Okay, so we'll talk about layers a little bit. This one actually has 2 layers, the original layer of the woman, JPEG, that we brought in, and also the adjustment, the fill color adjustment layer that we added in part 2. This is actually the file from part 3, of the color assignment. And you can see I can turn it off with the eyeball. Either one of them I can turn off with the eyeballs. Lock the layer as well. We can lock layers by making sure we highlight them. You can see when they're highlighted that they are slightly lighter gray. But I can lock this layer by highlighting it and clicking the lock. You can also unlock it by clicking the lock, or you can actually click on the actual icon in the layer, or you can click up here. Either way works. Sometimes you do need to lock layers down so that you're not accidentally grabbing them and moving them around. Sometimes you want them to stay stationary, so you might lock them. Layers stack vertically, so you might think of like the lowest layer as being underneath, and then the next layer being on top of it. So like, just think of it like kind of like a stacked sheet of paper, maybe sitting on top of one another, and that you're viewing them from the top. So this is one sheet of paper, maybe cut out in that shape, and then this is like a rectangle underneath it, and they're stacked on top of each other basically, and you're just viewing from the top, if that makes any sense. Yeah, and you can also merge layers together by selecting them and selecting them both by pushing Shift. You can get two things selected at the same time, and you can Control click and then go to merge layers here. So if I want to combine these two layers, I can make them one layer now instead of having that adjustment layer. I'm going to Command Z that. To undo. Command Z or Control Z on a PC. If you want to move around the order of layers, it's pretty easy. You just click and drag it underneath. So now that I did that, this layer is now underneath the woman image. I can turn her off with the eyeball and you'll see the layer underneath. I'll put it back on top. Okay, and then we can also talk about some of the options up here. So this is actually the blending mode for a selected layer. So we can actually, grab a layer and experiment with some of the blending modes. Actually, they usually don't show up unless it's over the top of another thing. So, I mean, I can change the blending mode on this selection of the color, solid color that we put in over the rows. And you can see the different blending modes that are available. So these are kind of cool to work with. They're fun to experiment with. The opacity of the layer is here. So we can turn down the opacity on things by using the slider. And you can see the percentage of the opacity there. If I did the opacity here on this one, you can see that, I can make it 0%, I can make it 41, and 100%. So that's the opacity. And we can delete layers easily by pushing, making sure it's highlighted and pushing the trash can. We can also add a layer, like a blank layer if we want, and we can move it around by moving it. We can add adjustment layers. So clicking on this half circle filled in thing, and we can add in, we did hue saturation already, but you can do black and white, you can do different things to experiment with. We've done a couple. We can do brightness contrast, that's a good one. And you can also group layers together. So if we push Shift on our keyboard, we can get multiple things selected at the same time, multiple layers, and then actually group them with this folder icon here. And that creates a group, and if you open that up, you can see the two layers that you created as a group. So that's basically kind of some of the basic things about the Layers panel. Next up, we'll talk about some selection tools. So the Tools panel is over here. Obviously, this is where we get most of our tools. This is the Move tool. It's pretty important, but we're actually going to talk about some of the selection tools, which actually happen to be mostly up in this upper right-hand corner. So this is just the Shape marquee tool. We can select different rectangles, and if we use the Move tool, we can see that, oops, I'm in the wrong layer. I need to be on the bottom layer so that I actually get selections from the image below, but I can actually move it with the Move tool. Once I've made my selection with the marquee tool, I can actually move it, and you'll see that and if I want to get rid of the dancing ants, I can do a Command D or Control D on a PC. Oops. So yeah, you can actually make selections with the Shape marquee tool. If you click and hold it down, you can see there's an elliptical, and there's a single row and a single column marquee tool. If I do Command D on my keyboard, I can deselect those dancing ants that show up. So there's also, here, we've actually used the Quick Selection tool before. It works quite well. If I try to get her figure, I can just kind of click and drag, and the computer does a decent job typically of selecting what you're trying to get. Sometimes you have to add or subtract from your selection with these buttons. You can also hold down Option on your keyboard to subtract from your selection. So let's say I don't really want these leaves in my selection. I can go back through and kind of clean up my selection a little bit with, by pushing Option down on my keyboard. Maybe I only want to get her skin tone. I can go back to the plus and add a little bit more in. I feel like some of her, more of her hairline would be appropriate. And maybe I want to subtract this little leaf here. So this is the Quick Selection tool. It's pretty great. It works really well. And then you can do Select and Mask, and you can actually create a clipping mask with this. Push OK, and you'll see that, Select and Mask. You can invert your selection easily here too. Then you can feather your selection here as well. Feather out the edges. If you go too far, it gets a little too blurry, but so that's basically quickly the quick selection tool. We'll keep going down the list here. The magic wand tool works really well, especially for solid blocks of color. Oops. And if you push shift on your keyboard and keep clicking, you can get more and more of the selection. It works fairly similarly to the quick selection tool, but it's a little bit faster, but it might not be as accurate at times as the quick selection tool. But it's great for selecting solid colors, and you can make it more, change the tolerance either to like a higher number or lower number, and experiment how that works. But changing the tolerance makes it more sensitive or less sensitive, depending on what you're looking for. There's also, this is a newer tool, the object selection tool. So typically if you're on the right layer, which I am, if you kind of just click over the object that you're trying to select, the computer will do a pretty good job of just finding the object, especially in this particular image, since it's just a woman on a blank background. The computer can do a really good job of finding the object in the image that you're trying to select. And a lot of times the object selection tool is the fastest way to select something. It definitely depends on the image that you're working with, but a lot of times it will work quite well. I tend to still really like the quick selection tool, but the object selection tool is pretty great too. Next up, we'll go into like some color correcting things. Even though we did do the color exercise, there's a couple extra things I want to show you. So if I actually use the shape marquee tool, I'm going to use the rectangular one, and I'm on the right layer here, so I'm going to select just a chunk of this, and then I'll go to the adjustment layers down here at the bottom of the layers panel, and then I'm going to do brightness and contrast, which is another one, much like hue saturation. In the properties panel, you can see you can adjust the brightness of that selection, and we can adjust the contrast of it. So a lot of times the brightness and contrast of an image can be adjusted with these sliders. Obviously I'm just doing a section of it. As you can see, it's become a little mask in there. But that is the brightness contrast. We already went through hue saturation. I'm not going to show you color balance because I don't think it's used quite as often. But I'll show you how to transform the image that you're working with as well next up. Okay, so let's say I have, this is my background layer, and I want to bring in another layer on top of an image. So I can to bring in another image into Photoshop, you just need to do a file place. You can do place embedded or place linked. I tend to say do place embedded. You can use either, but place embedded is the one that I tend to tell students to use. Let's say I want to use this Bear Paw Mountains landscape. It's a JPEG. Just like this image is a JPEG. I'm going to place a image, so I'm actually placing an image within an image. And as you can see, it's pretty small. That probably means that it's low resolution. So if I want to transform the size of something, I can do Command T on my keyboard, and that works really well. You can also go to Edit, Free Transform, but Command T or Control T on a PC will work quite well for you. You can push Shift. Actually, no, you don't have to push Shift anymore in Photoshop. You can actually just click and drag it from the corner, and it will size up proportionally. If you want to squish it, you push Shift, and you can squish it. But I'm going to Command Z that because I didn't actually want to squish it at all. So I can put it here, and as you can see, it came in underneath the color fill layer. So if I want to move it on top, I can do that by just kind of moving it up above the group. If I can get it up there, there we go. So now it's on top, and I can move it around. So just remember, Command T is a great way to change the size of an image. Not just for changing the size. If you do Command T, you can also rotate it. You just have to get over here in the corner, and then you can see a little arrow that goes both ways, and you can rotate your image too. Next up, I'll be talking about file types quickly. Basically, the PSD file, the .psd file, is the Photoshop file. That's the native file that preserves all of your layers. It's your working file. You can export out JPEGs from Photoshop, and they are flat. They have no layers, and they're a smaller file size, so they're great for emailing and those kinds of things. PSD files are harder to email. PNG files are also smaller file size, but they're also RGB. So they're for web and or screen, and they allow for transparency. And that's about it that I wanted to go over.